Hello, everyone. As the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies, I welcome you to today's session of the Persian Lithographic Printing Seminar Series featuring Professor Ulrike Stark of the University of Chicago. This series is co-convened by my colleagues, Dr. Mahdi Ganjavi and Shabnam Gulkhandan of the University of Toronto. This series is also co-sponsored by the University of Toronto's Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, the Canadian Society for Iranian and Persian Studies, the Iran Namag Quarterly of Iranian Studies, the Iranian Studies Student Forum, Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation, and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute. Before introducing Professor Stark, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague Mahdi Ganjavi will introduce Professor Stark, and Shabnam will moderate today's session. Mahdi Jan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tawakkoli, for your opening remarks. It is my honor to introduce Professor Ulrike Stark. While I'm sure most people here are already familiar with the magnificent work Dr. Stark has done and her contributions to the field, allow me to provide a brief introduction. Ulrike Stark is a professor in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on modern Hindi literature, South Asian book history, and the cultural and intellectual history of North India in the 19th and 20th centuries. She is the author of An Empire of Books, the Naval Kishore Press, and the Diffusion of the Printed Word in Colonial India, published by Permanent Black 2007, and has published widely on South Asian print culture. She is also the co-creator and principal investigator of Chaparkhana, a digital humanities project that maps the spread of print in South Asia. I highly encourage those of you who have not checked this initiative to do so. I just shared the link to it via chats. This initiative combines bibliographical and geographical data to explore the development of the region's printing industry between 1800 and 1900, providing scholars with innovative tools to examine the connections between print, society, and cultural transformation in colonial South Asia. Two other publications that are particularly noteworthy for this seminar's emphasis are Calligraphic Masterpiece, Mass-Produced Scripture, Early Quran's Printing in Colonial India, which was published in manuscript and print in the Islamic tradition. Also, Letters, Beautiful and Harmful, Print, Education, and the Issue of Script in Colonial North India, which was also published back in 2019. Professor Stark is currently working on an exciting project titled Majestic Patronage, Muslim and Christian Printing at the Lucknow Royal Press, 1819-1849. Before I pass the floor to Dr. Stark, I would also like to make a brief note about the slides. We kindly ask all participants to refrain from taking screenshots or photographs of the slides, as the speaker is still awaiting permissions for distribution from the relevant institutions. Having said that, we are all The floor is yours, Dr. Stark, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ganjavi, for this very generous introduction. I would also like to thank Professor Tawakkoli Targhi and Dr. Golkhandan, as well as all the institutional sponsors of this lecture series for giving me this opportunity to workshop my current research on lithographic book illustration in 19th century India. So while addressing an understudied aspect of South Asian book history, this talk today is also inspired by the emerging discipline of illustration studies, which has brought into focus the industrial uses of illustration, for long a stepchild of art, as one scholar has poignantly noted. I'm not a scholar of Persian literature, and this is my first foray into visual culture, so I'm much looking forward to your comments and insights in the Q&A. So let me now share my screen. Can you see everything okay? Okay. So, as many of you already know, lithography was introduced to India in the 1820s and quickly became the dominant mode of book production in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Well suited to reproducing the cursive Perso-Arabic scripts, it derived its cultural authority from its visual proximity to the manuscript. As Graham Shaw has memorably noted, lithography allowed for a cultural paradox, the mass-produced manuscript. Cheap, portable, and easy to operate, it enabled even small workshops to print in different languages and scripts, a critical advantage in India's multilingual and multi-script economy. The versatile technology, moreover, lent itself well to ornamentation and illustration. Along with its cultural and aesthetic appeal, a socio-economic factor proved critical to its acceptance in the subcontinent. Unlike movable type, lithography did not threaten the monopoly of professional scribes. Sorry, I'm trying to... So. Indian lithographic illustration remains an understudied and underappreciated art. Assessments of its artistic value tend to be guarded, if not dismissive, often referring to lithographic images as crude or coarse in comparison to earlier modes of book illustration. These images indeed vary greatly in style and quality of workmanship, and we come across many roughly executed ones, especially in cheap ephemeral publications. However, as I will argue today, such comparisons are neither helpful nor productive from the book historian's perspective. They fail to do justice to a new industrial art that was subject to the imperatives of mass production and the consumer market economy. The modest artistic quality of lithographed illustrations should by no means justify their disregard, writes Ulrich Marzelf, underscoring the social aspect of an art form that was closer to the common people than elite art serving the privileged. Indian lithographic artists, especially those illustrating books from Hindu and Sikh culture, often took inspiration from folk art traditions. They deliberately adopted a visual idiom that, if appearing naive or unrefined in purely aesthetic terms, resonated with contemporary audiences. So once we assess lithographic illustration on its own terms, we begin to appreciate artists' efforts to make the most of this monochrome idiom. I'll come to lithography a little later. Artists produced images that are not only carefully composed, but abound in decorative flourishes, in the various carpet designs, in the use of geometric patterns for tiles and architectural elements, in the depiction of plants and foliage of leaves, and in the special attention paid to costume, the sartorial details of a figure's attire signifying both individuality and typicality. The emergence of lithographic book illustration is intimately linked to the spread of commercial printing in South Asian languages beginning in the 1840s. It coincided with the rise of literacy, popular education, and the formation of a diverse reading publics in mutually constitutive ways. By the 1880s, it had become a truly popular art form designed for and consumed by a mass reading public. When the Naval Kishore Press of Lucknow published the fourth edition of its celebrated illustrated Gulistan in 1889, it did so in a print run of 10,000 copies, sold at a modest price of 7 annas, that is less than half a rupee. Given the transformation of book culture initiated by print technology and the growth and new attention paid to reading publics, I have become very interested in a subset of illustrations that self-reflectively capture the bond between human agent and object, that is, images depicting scenes of reading and writing. Focusing on the iconography of the book at a historical moment of transition allows us to explore how Indian artists engaged with the past while creatively responding to their own rapidly changing environment. Many such illustrations are modeled on earlier depictions of book culture found in the manuscript tradition, while others provide original glimpses into contemporary Indian practice. The spaces depicted are both traditional and modern. The royal court, the mosque, the madrasa, the private parlor, the garden, but also the primary school and the colonial law court. As these images tell us about norms and conventions of reading and writing, they also offer a visual record of the material culture of the book, past and present. In their attention to materiality, they constitute a repository of information on the paraphernalia of book culture, putting on display a variety of objects: manuscripts, codex volumes, scrolls, letters, writing tablets, reed pens, pen holders, and inkwells, as well as the furniture for reading. Reading, as Adrian Johns reminds us in his recent The Science of Reading, is historically conditioned. It is also culturally specific. In exploring bookish practices in the context and through the lens of 19th century South Asia, two related patterns are visible from the outset. First, the images discussed here are deeply invested in the overlapping worlds of orality and textuality. Reading, as both a sacred and secular activity, most often takes the form of reading aloud or recitation. Second, unlike 19th century Europe, visual representations of book culture are not yet concerned with private reading, and they show little interest in what Garrett Stewart terms the inwardness of silent reading. With some notable exceptions, the solitary reader as absorbed subject figures rarely in these early illustrations. Indeed, the images mostly depict communal or public reading practices and project a sense of communality and sociability. Attendant figures are onlookers or listening participants in settings of shared reading. As such, they represent both actual and symbolic audiences. Scholarship has identified illustrations as a parallel visual art and detailed the intricate interplay between word and image. Michael Chagnon, for instance, has highlighted the intertextual performativity of manuscript images borrowing elements from other works of Persian classical poetry. Yet, lithographic images have thus far been largely discussed for their narrative function. As I hope to show today, they also deserve to be studied for their symbolic, aesthetic, and affective dimensions. As it is, lithographic illustration as a book art has received little attention in South Asian print history. Despite growing interest in lithography, there exists no scholarship on book illustration comparable to the research done by Ulrike and many others for Iran. Most recently, his luminous study co-authored with Roxana Zenhari of the Persian master illustrator Mir-Djalali. Let us turn to lithography in India. In India, lithographic illustration entered a diverse and changing visual economy. It overlapped with and succeeded the traditional book arts of illumination and illustration. It paralleled and surpassed engravings, the popular Calcutta woodcut prints, and the company-style paintings of Delhi, Lucknow, and Banaras. It assimilated elements from Persian, Mughal, and Rajput painting, as well as folk art traditions like the Kalighat paintings of Bengal. We must also note that lithographic illustration became mainstream around the same time the new technology of photography appeared in India in the 1840s. The resulting interplay of these two image-making technology merits further study. For instance, lithographic illustrations based on photographs regularly appeared in periodicals. The early history of lithographic illustration in India is linked to colonial projects. Besides landscape drawings by East India Company officials, these include the topographic, botanical, and ethnographic drawings of European amateur artists like Sir Charles D'Oyly, who set up the Bihar Lithographic Press in Patna in 1828. D'Oyly's Bihar School of Athens has been discussed by Tom Young as an early case of amateur artistic sociability, in that it featured the work by two Indian artists. In Calcutta, the British artist Colworthy Grant compiled a series of miscellaneous rough sketches of Oriental heads, which contains multiple pictorial reading scenes, including this beautiful one of a Brahmin scholar at the Calcutta Sanskrit College, manuscript in hand. By contrast, the beginning of lithographic illustration in Indian language books is still uncertain. Basic questions have only been partially answered. What, for example, was the first illustrated lithographic book produced in the subcontinent under Indian aegis? And this, for me, includes Iranian printing in India. Which genres were chosen for illustration? And who were the lithographic artists? Lithographic illustration became a commercial art meant for popular consumption in the 1840s. Daniel Sheffield has drawn attention to the Rostamnama, a Gujarati version of the Shahnama, as a possible first. It was published in Bombay in 1843 by the pioneering Parsi print entrepreneur Fardunji Marzabanji. Bombay, where lithography was introduced in the early 1820s, was also the site of the first ever illustrated editions of the Shahnama, published by Muhammad Mehdi Esfahani in 1846 and Muhammad Baqir Shirazi in 1849, and variously reprinted over the next 13 years. The British Library holds an exquisite copy of the 1849 edition, which you can see here, with 57 hand-colored illustrations. Produced by Iranian publishers settled in Bombay, they involved Iranian illustrators and calligraphers. These books were meant for both the domestic and Persian market, while they held special importance for Bombay's Parsi community. India, we must remember, remained the major production site for the Persian national epic until the 1920s. Lithographed Shahnames provide a prime example of the crisscrossing of influence between India and Iran. As Martzelf has shown, the two early Indian editions initiated different iconographic traditions of illustrating the Shahnameh in Iran. The celebrated Mir-Djalali Quli was inspired by the 1846 Bombay edition for his own illustrations adorning the first Tehran edition of 1851. In North India, where Persian remained the official and court language until 1837, the cities of Lucknow, Kanpur, and Banaras emerged as early centers of indigenous lithography. At Lucknow, the Matbai Sultani or Royal Press, the first Muslim-owned press in North India, established by the kings of Awadh in 1819, switched from movable type to lithography in 1830, midway through the production of its monumental Persian dictionary, Taj al-Lughat. In Banaras, the first lithographic press opened in 1844, and within the next 10 years, we see an upsurge of illustrations in Hindu religious and devotional works. Lithographic illustrations in commercially produced books was confined to specific genres. Along with the Persian classics and Indian epics, these comprised popular narrative texts like romances, adventure stories, and ethical or religious stories. Other categories include folk tales, devotional poetry, cosmographies of the wonders of creation genre, as you see here, school textbooks, and toward the end of the century, modern novels. There is great variation in the rate of illustration and distribution across any given text. The designation illustrated, ba tasvir, ba tasvirat, ma tasavir, sachitra, and so on, could mean anything from the book containing 1 or 2 images to a full pictorial cycle. The program of illustration in large-scale production, like the Persian classics, shows continuity with the manuscript tradition, in that it replicated a standard corpus of scenes found in miniature illustrations of the texts. Besides reproducing a familiar visual repertoire, artists also modeled specific images after the composition standardized in manuscript books. Along with many generic images and recurring motifs, we also find compositions of great originality. The same continuity with manuscript practice applies to the way images were fitted onto the pages. Illustrations were generally inserted after the text portion of the book was completed in a framed area reserved for the image. They can therefore sometimes be seen to overlap the frames or text. Sizes ranged from small vignettes to full-page illustrations. Images in Persian and Urdu books often bear inscriptions identifying the figures depicted or come with a caption or breakline. With a few exceptions, the images discussed here are all monochrome, though they were subsequently hand-colored. Most of them predate the rise of chromolithography in Indian printing in the 1880s. The case of hand-colored books raises an interesting question. Was the hand coloring commissioned by individual patrons, or was a number of copies hand-colored by the press to meet market demand for a deluxe version of the edition? There is evidence that publishers responded to readers' increasing appetite for colored pictures. The Anwar Muhammadi Press of Lucknow advertised its lavishly illustrated edition of the Masnavi Gulshan-e-Ishq for 2 rupees and hand colors Rangeen copies for 4 rupees. Similarly, Gauri Dutt's early Hindi novel Devrani Jetani Ki Kahani, or A Story of Two Sisters-in-Law, a humble work with only 4 images, was marked in a plain edition priced at 7 annas, and one with colored pictures and colored floral borders priced at 10 annas. So while hand coloring made books more expensive, illustration as such did not. Contrary to what we may assume, and this is a surprising takeaway from my research so far, lithographic illustration did not substantially increase the price of any given title. By the 1880s, illustrated editions had become entirely affordable, suggesting that artistic labor was cheap, while industrialized mass production further reduced prices, putting such books well within the range of the average consumer. The consumer, we must note here, was not confined to India. Persian titles were exported to Iran and the larger Persianate world in substantial numbers. Let us turn to the unknown artists. Archival sources offer few glimpses into what Sheffield has called the unstudied world of the 19th century book illustrator. Lithographic artists are seldom identified in Indian books and in most cases remain unknown. It is not before the 1880s that illustrators begin to sign their work more regularly, suggesting that by the last decades of the century, and under the impact of colonial copyright laws, they developed a sense of recognition of artists' creative work. We even come across a hidden signature in a playful emulation of a practice found in early modern Persian manuscripts. Even in the rare instances where illustrations contain the artist's signature or where their names occur elsewhere in the books, we know little about their training, the contractual arrangements of their labor, and the technical difficulties they may have faced. Martov cites the complaints of Persian calligraphers about the difficulties of writing with lithographic ink due to its viscous quality. He notes that, quote, illuminators and artists aiming to produce extremely delicate lines and fine drawings might have found their task even more arduous, end quote. Willem Floor has traced the evolution of writing instruments used by Persian artists. Following the introduction of photography, the delineating pencil, which produced drawings of not very high quality, was replaced by the so-called fat pencil, a crease crayon that allowed artists to apply shading and facial expressions just as in photographs. Indian artists, we may assume, were affected by the same changes. Their illustrations range from exquisite to poorly executed, indicating the unevenness of their training as much as the varying quality of the actual printing process. The functions of scribe, katib, and illustrator, musawwir, were sometimes exercised by the same person. This, interestingly, is also reflected in Hindi illustrated books, where the Sanskrit term likitam denotes both written, inscribed, and drawn. Like their counterparts in Qajar, Iran, Indian visual artists and calligraphers were affected by the decline of court and elite patronage. In search of new opportunities of employment, they turned to the expanding commercial print industry and adapted their skills to the popular new medium of lithography. As Amanda Lanzillo has shown in her work on Muslim artisan communities, that artists were often hired to do piecework for presses. Beginning from the 1850s, training opportunities were no longer confined to small community-based or family workshops, but expanded to commercial presses and the new colonial and industrial art schools. They offered vocational training in lithography. By the 1860s, the Calcutta School of Art instructed Indians in lithography along with mechanical drawing, wood engraving, and photography. As a leading Anglo-Indian newspaper noted at the time, the art school made no pretension to teaching high art, I quote, "Its scope is purely practical, and its projectors are satisfied with training art workmen without attempting to produce artists," end quote. While being characteristically dismissive of native pictorial art, the paper considered lithography a remunerated craft, highlighting its industrial uses. I wanted to give you some sense of stability, variation, and repetition in these images. Ulrich Marzow has noted the relative stability in the program of illustrations in Qajar, Iran, throughout the period of lithographic production. Instability came in the form of variation in the execution of illustrations across multiple editions of the same work. The lavishly illustrated editions of Sadi's Gulistan, published by the Naval Kishore Press in 1886 and 1889, present an interesting case of this. A landmark in Indian lithography, they had images on almost every page, with many pages featuring more than one image. While the page layout and illustrative cycle of both editions are identical, the images are by multiple artists and differ in style and execution. The 1886 edition is superbly illustrated by one Qaim Ali Naqash Lakhnavi, whose name identifies him as a Lucknow painter. The illustrations in the 1889 edition, which you see here, are equally refined, but drawn by at least two different hands. While the first 40 images or so closely resemble those of the earlier editions, most of the subsequent ones are executed in a more contemporary style, displaying bolder outlines, an emphasis on individual traits, and lively facial expressions. They also project a new degree of animation, indeed theatricality, that contrasts with the more static appearance of the conventional earlier images. The artist who signed his work with the pen name Shock also took liberties with the composition of scenes. We happen to know about the identity of Shock, a Hindu named Ganga Sahai, because he appears in the colonial record as an illustrator working for Awadh Punch, a famous satirical Urdu weekly published from Lucknow between 1877 and 1915. Shock's Gulistan illustration resemble his sketches in Awadh Punch, displaying the influence of European-style cartoon art. Another interesting case is Majales al-Ushaq, The Assemblies of Lovers, a famous Persian work on the theme of divine and material love that depicts the passion of Sufi mystics, prophets, and royal personages in 75 short biographies. Composed by the Timurid courtier Kamaluddin Hussein Ghazurgahi around 1503, the work enjoyed great popularity in Safavid Iran and Ottoman Turkey, as attested by a rich tradition of illustrated manuscripts. However, it was in India that Majales al-Ushaq was first put into print in 1870 by Naval Kishore and twice reprinted in 1876 and 1897. In keeping with the manuscript tradition, the three editions are profusely illustrated by 75 images. While their pictorial cycle is the same, the 1897 edition shows the hand of a less skilled artist, perhaps already indicating the future decline of lithographic illustration as a commercial art. Not only are these images less refined, but they also present a curious case of erasure. The book objects that emblematize knowledge and the intimate relations of these encounters have disappeared from several images. Take, for example, this scene from the 8th Majlis or assembly, and I have no explanation for this at this point. Before we turn to the iconography of reading and writing, a word on repetition is in order. We have already seen that lithographic illustrations replicated the pictorial program established by the manuscript tradition of specific texts. Many illustrations found in Persian and Urdu books are also modeled on Persian or Mughal styles of drawing. Commercial print, moreover, repurposed the individual image. Versions of the same scene can be found in multiple editions of a text, while stock images were used across titles. Many are generic compositions depicting figures with stereotypical gestures and facial expressions. As Rocher Chartier has argued in the context of the French Bibliothèque Bleue, images were among the various elements functioning as, quote, protocols of reading or sites of memory, lieux de mémoire, in texts that assumed their readers' foreknowledge. By the recurrence of highly coded forms, the repetition of similar motifs from one title to another, and the use of the same images, the knowledge of texts already encountered was mobilized to help in the comprehension of new readings, end quote. Similarly, research on reader spectatorship in the novels of Charles Dickens has shown that it was the reliance on previous artistic representations and familiarity that made illustrations so effective and a source of pleasure to readers. India, in this regard, was not that different from the Victorian case, where it has been argued viewing was seen as an essential part of reading, with illustrators communicating through understandable expressions, gestures, symbols, and props. Scholars of illustration often refer to readers engaged in interpreting text and image as the reader/viewer, a helpful concept in the present context. As we will see, in Indian lithographic illustration, the emphasis on the familiar was an asset rather than a flaw, with the reader/viewer's pleasure deriving from the recognizability of a distinct language of art. Let us now turn to the book objects. As Lucy Freeman Sandler has shown in the context of European medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, images featuring books are of two main types. They either depict books as symbols or show books in use. As a religious, cultural, or social signifier, the book often occupies the center of the illustration, especially in the case of scripture. Whether manuscript or print, in scroll, codex, or poti format, whether blank, inscribed with pseudotext, or bearing legible inscriptions, it functions as an emblem of spiritual discipline or worldly authority, variably indexing faith, devotion, knowledge, or mundane power. It is the chief pictorial symbol of the Word of God and a standard accoutrement of angels, mystics, and saints. A manuscript leaf is one of the iconic attributes of the Hindu god Brahma, the creator. Pictorial representations of the book in use include the tactile act of holding the book object, whose presence, whether read or unread, projects a textual aura. Reading is portrayed as an act of self-cultivation and self-improvement, often invested with spiritual significance. Figures of worldly authority are shown in the presence of the holy book, most often a Quran, or a secular book that functions as a source of legitimacy and prestige. Book images can also be self-referential. We have already seen the striking full-page frontispiece depicting the poet Firdausi at the court of his patron Sultan Mahmud in Bombay Shahnames. Firdausi is facing the three court poets Unzari, Asjadi, and Faruqi, who stand with their arms folded. The viewer's eye here is directed from the towering figure of Sultan Mahmud to the Shahnama, which appears in the form of a scroll and is inscribed with a verse from the text. Another frequently depicted textual object is the letter. Unlike the book, it is primarily of narrative significance. An emissary delivering a letter to a princely figure, or more rarely, a love letter being written or read. Let us briefly dwell on Nauratan, the 9 Jewels, a frequently reprinted collection of Urdu stories composed in 1815 by Muhammad Bakhsh Mahjoor of Lucknow. It offers an extraordinary image of a secluded woman dictating a letter to a letter writer, a khat navis, from behind a makeshift curtain. The story is one of doomed love. A wife requests the assistance of a scribe to write to her husband, who is away on travel. As she dictates the letter, she expresses her longing for her husband. Moved by her passion, the scribe falls in love with her and asks her to repeat her words. Pir kaho, he says in Urdu, and then flirtatiously switches to a Persian register. Oh, ringdove, seated on the cypress along the side of the flowing stream, say it again. With each repetition, his passion intensifies. Eventually, he runs away to the desert, Majnun-like. One day, a stranger falsely tells him that his beloved drowned while bathing in a pond. And at this, he loses his mind, throws himself in the same pond, and dies. News of this travels back to the woman, who in turn is overcome by feelings of love and drowns herself in the same pond. The two bodies are recovered in a state of eternal embrace and are buried together. This may all sound quite familiar to you. So in the image, the woman's pensive gaze is lifted upwards, as if seeking inspiration, her hand stretched out in a conventional gesture of discourse. The left-handed scribe is engrossed in taking dictation, his face lowered over the words as he is putting down on paper. A stylus and inkwell complete the scene. The curtain separating the two lovers is as material as it is symbolic. The sense of intimacy conveyed by this picture is enhanced by the secluded woman's face and body being revealed to us as viewers, affording us some almost voyeuristic pleasure. At a time when female literacy was still rare and frequently frowned upon, the image plays into patriarchal anxieties, while it also invokes forbidden desire. I now want to turn to the spaces, the settings, and gestures and postures of reading. The spatial arrangement of the stationary, though never static act of reading, is marked by the juxtaposition of interior and exterior spaces. The indoors and outdoors collapse in the set image of a customary space for reading, which lithographic illustration borrows from the manuscript tradition. That is, a terrace overlooking a garden whose lush vegetation provides both backdrop and framing. Reading, Garrett Stewart suggests, marks the effective hinge between nature and culture. While architectural elements often have a decorative quality in these images, they also serve to situate reading and writing in an elite environment. This impression is reinforced by the attention given to the fashionable attire worn by the figures depicted. Furnishings include carpets, drapes, large cushions, and small bolsters. A rare depiction of a bookcase can be found in the 1889 edition of Sa'di's Golestan, where chapter 237 recounts a conversation between a father and his son, a young expert on Islamic law, who questions the authority of scholars who do not practice what they preach. The youth's bookish knowledge and intellectual hubris find material expression in the hefty tomes sitting on the bookshelf. In the images surveyed here, we most often find the book in the hands of men, indicating that book culture was perceived as a male domain. Images of domestic reading, as both a silent, solitary pursuit and a familiar ritual, are conspicuous in their absence in 19th century Indian lithographed books. So is the woman as reader a prominent motif in European art of the period. Indian lithographic images display nothing of the fascination with inwardness and emotion that permeates so many European depictions of the reading girl or woman. Likewise, illustrators typically shy away from the theme of pleasure and desire associated with female reading in European art. This is hardly surprising given the overall low female literacy in India and strong cultural taboos surrounding female reading and writing that prevailed throughout much of the century, evoking the dangers of moral corruption of the literate woman. Unlike in Europe, Indian women did not yet constitute a sizable segment in the print market, though, and I want to stress this, they were consumers of much more than the textbooks, conduct books, and religious manuals prescribed for them. The figure of the reading woman will only make its appearance in Indian illustrations in the early 20th century and remain largely confined to women's magazines and a context of enlightened domesticity. An early instance of reading as a leisure pursuit can be found on the title page of the Hindi magazine Griha Lakshmi, the Lakshmi of the Home, in 1913. The woman lounging in an armchair here is engrossed in her book, her back turned to us. Her pose of abandon suggests reading as a private pleasure and what Francesco Orsini has called the right to feel. All this does not mean that women are absent from earlier 19th century depictions of book culture. While the illustrations assert reading as a male prerogative, women regularly appear as listening subjects in scenes of oral instruction. It is not surprising that the examples I have come across thus far are scenes of religious reading like the ones found in the Qissa-i Rum. This hugely popular story of a Turkish king is a story where the king is punished by God for scoffing at a Quranic verse. The verse is Surah 3:26, reminding the powerful of their mortality and subjection of their power to God's will. In punishment, the Shah is transported to China, where he is taken for a highway robber and has his hands and feet cut off. Assigned to be the tutor of the Chinese princess, he teaches her the Quran. In the event, he comes across the same verse, repents, and is pardoned by God. The Chinese emperor then marries him to his daughter, his hands and feet are restored, and he is transported back to his homeland. The artist has chosen a central scene in the narrative, captioned "The robber instructs the princess." The setting is a terrace, the background suggests an elite dwelling. A bookstand holding an open Quran sits between teacher and pupil, who is accompanied by a female attendant. While marking a turning point in the story, the image evokes the sacred future bond of marriage, as replicated in multiple representations of Muslim wedding ceremonies, where the Quran invariably occupies center stage. Reading is always a practice embodied in gestures, spaces, and habits, writes Roger Chartier. Lithographic illustrations replicate conventional hand gestures taken from the repertoire of Persian and Mughal painting, or, in the case of Hindu and Sikh books, Indic mudras. Figures have their right hand stretched out, palm turned up in a standard gesture of interlocution. We see the raised hand and bent forefinger as a sign of respect, and the well-known Persian finger of astonishment, a gesture signifying wonder or puzzlement, with the right index finger raised to the lips. The hand holding the book is often outstretched, prominently displaying the physical object. Forefingers pointing at the book draw attention to its material presence and symbolic meaning. Hands resting on an open page convey the effective bond between reader and object. Reading as embodied practice, of course, also involves posture. The typical reading pose is kneeling or sitting cross-legged on the floor or a carpet. Many of the compositions are double kneeling portraits, a standard motif of social intercourse. Readers and writers are reclining on large bolsters with small cushions supporting their knees or feet. Religious figures or kings are depicted seated. on a throne or a takht. Rarely do we find a figure seated on a chair, a piece of furniture indexing colonial modernity, and typically occupied by a representative of the colonial state. Take, for example, this image from Mir Aman's Urdu rendering of the tale of the four dervishes, hailing his patron at Fort William College, Lord Harrington. How then did the artists evoke reading under colonial modernity? A novel setting representing contemporary life is the colonial law court, a space often depicted in a satirical vein. A characteristic image in a bold style that recalls the cartoons of contemporary Punch magazines can be found in Piri Nabalik, an immature old man, an Urdu story on the folly of old men marrying young women. It is by Mirza Herat Dehlavi. Colonial authority is embodied in the figure of a stern-looking magistrate seated behind an imposing desk. An Indian court scribe takes dictation as the opposed party's lawyers, appropriately named Mr. Careless and Mr. Playful, La Ubali and Chulbule, present their petitions. Similarly, Ratanath Sarshar's didactic Urdu novel, Jame Sarshar, features a scene in which the protagonist, a young Lucknow Nawab with a weakness for drink and dancing girls, ends up before a judge after his coach ran over a potter's ware in the rush to meet his paramour. Despite their stylistic differences, both images suggest that reading in the court comes from a place up high, with the weight of the law bearing down heavily on the hapless Indian subject. Several images reflect the changing educational landscape, marking the transition from homeschooling and madrasa to the government school. One of the most recognizable school scenes in Persian art is arguably of the child lovers Layla and Majnun at school, a cherished motif contained in manuscripts of Nizami's masterpiece. It is replicated in two Indian lithographs from Bombay. While the two images are similar in composition, the artist of the later edition adds a striking detail. Inscribed on Majnun's tablet, we find Layla's name. The union of the letters accentuate the lover's pining for a union never achieved in the poem, while it also cleverly prefigures the inscription of Layla's name on Majnun's chest we find in compositions of the famous scene of Majnun at the Kaaba. The point I want to make here is that more than just a charming detail, images like this, as simply as they may appear, ask us to look closely. They draw us in, generating what Persis Berlekamp, in a different context, has called the visual pleasure of the non-specialist viewer. Not surprisingly, the illustrated Gulistan offers multiple images of both private study and school learning, especially in its 7th chapter on the effects of education. A rare sense of humor pervades this unique image in Story 7.4, illustrating a maxim from the text: when master and teacher are lenient, children play leapfrog in the marketplace. The anecdote illustrates two schoolmasters in the Maghreb, one ill-tempered and cruel, the other, Sadi tells us, quote, a pious man of great rectitude, a good and compassionate man who spoke only when necessary and never hurt anyone with his words, end quote. In a literally striking case of the misuse of writing tools, the students are depicted here hitting each other on the head with their tablets, while their mild-mannered teacher looks on. Featured in the background is the mosque to which the school belongs, providing an ironic contrast to the rowdy play going on outside. The school is typically a more tranquil space marked by order and obedience. Following the Education Dispatch of 1856, India saw the introduction of formal primary education, and with it, the printed textbook, a new sacred icon of required knowledge. It gave rise to a lucrative textbook market. Hindi primers like Balopadesh depict the elementary school as an aspirational place of useful devotion to learning. This cover is typical in situating instruction in a traditional context of elite homeschooling. Teachers and pupils are seated on a carpet in a private drawing room. The teacher, propped up against the ubiquitous cushion, is reading out from an inscribed tablet. Though their faces, all rendered in profile, are fairly stylized, the artist managed to capture a look of attentiveness in the student's expression. These are generic yet carefully scripted scenes. Order and embodied authority are conveyed by the centrality of the teacher, a figure of proportionally larger size, and the symmetrically arranged groups of learners. These images idealize learning and, in their affluent settings, are a far cry from the shabbiness of real-life primary schools in 19th century India. The same visual evocation of privilege can be found even on the covers of an ephemeral genre, such as the series of Nagari copybooks published from Lucknow in 1879. My last section is called Portrait of an Author. A new feature of commercial book printing was the illustrated title page, and with it, the depiction of readers and writers on the cover. Title page images were a cheap and effective advertising tool meant to enhance a book's visual appeal. As we have seen, alphabet books announced their purpose visually. Along with the reader, the writer comes into view. Industrial printing entailed the rise of the professional author and modern concepts of authorship. Anticipating the photographic portraiture of later days, the portrait of the author as frontispiece or title page image crystallizes his identity as a recognizable figure. Such portraits typically feature the solitary author surrounded by his writing implements. While oscillating between accuracy and idealization, they tend to emphasize individuation. The portrait of a contemplative Sadi found in the Lucknow Gulistan may well have been inspired by Mirza Ali Qoli Khoi's frontispiece rendering in the 1850 Tehran edition of the Goliad-e-Sadi. While frontispiece portraits have a long history in European publishing, they first appear in Indian-authored books in the 1830s. The earliest lithographed portraits can be found in two panegyrics of British rule. One is Iqbal-e-Farang, or British Prosperity, by Nawab Iqbal-ud-Dawla, a bilingual work printed in Calcutta in 1837. The other is the monumental Persian Georgename by Mullah Firoz, a noted Parsi scholar and chief priest of the Kadmi sect in Bombay's Zoroastrian community. That's Bombay, 1837. But it was not until the 1870s that author portraits became more common in Urdu books. An intriguing case of authorial promotion is that of the Masnavi-e Mir Hassan, a popular Urdu romance by Mir Hassan Dehlavi, who became the poster boy of title page portraiture in Urdu books. Starting from the 1870s, most editions of the Masnavi bear images of the author on the title page. They depict Mir Hassan seated in a private parlor, pen and paper in hand, with writing implements spread on the floor around him. An inscription reading Shabi-e Mir Hassan Musannaf-e Kitab helps readers easily identify the figure. Mir Hassan's pose is pensive, his gaze wandering into the distance, as if contemplating a new composition. By showcasing portraits of Mir Hassan, Delhi printers set a trend that quickly took on in the publishing history of this particular text. By the 1880s, the now iconic image of the poet, easily recognizable by his facial features, distinctive moustache, and skull cap, features on the title page of Masnavis published from Lucknow in Devanagari and Urdu script versions. Why this attempt at authorial marketability did not catch on for other eminent writers remains unclear to me. My final image is a slightly different author portrait found in the Qissai Hatim Tai Manzoom, an Urdu verse rendering of the popular romance Araish-i Mahfil. Unlike the solitary author image of Mir Hassan, the author Mir Tansukrai Khairabadi is shown on the terrace in the company of a young man, presumably a pupil, against the backdrop of a garden. In front of the author, we find a qalamdan or pen box, the prime emblem of the writer's occupation. A copy of the text, inscribed with its title, sits between the two figures, but closer to the youth, invoking both oral and written practices of textual transmission. We may well read this image as an homage to traditional practice, the youth receiving the author's ijazat, or permission to transmit the text. At the same time, there is a distinctly contemporary ring to it. Both figures are facing outward, their gaze directed toward the viewer, much like in a modern photograph. Let me conclude. Lithographic illustration, I hope to have shown, deserves to be studied more closely as a commercial book art of popular appeal, as well as a rich source for the representation of material culture and cultural practices. At a time of unprecedented access to books, book images remain a favorite topic. In engaging a visual dialogue with the past and present, they help us to uncover both idealized versions and historical evidence of reading and writing. As Stefan Bohlmann asserts, even images of reading need to be read. Several trends emerge from this preliminary exploration. The crisscrossing of artistic inspiration between India and Iran, the insistence on the social dimensions of reading, the intertwined history of lithographic illustrations and photography, as suggested by the changing visual aesthetic as we approach the 20th century. Writing in 1891, the British artist William Simpson mourned the decay of lithography as a method of book illustration, calling it, quote, a finished chapter in the history of illustrative arts and a thing of the past, unquote. His gloomy assessment is clearly contradicted by the case of India, where lithographic text and image continued to enjoy great popularity well into the 20th century, appealing to both literate and seasoned readerships. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Exceptional.
Thank you, Professor Stark. I'm having a little bit of a trouble with my camera. My apologies, I'll set it up in a minute. I encourage everybody to write their questions. And I would ask Mehdi-Jan to help me moderate as well, because I was a little bit out of loop that I'm moderating. So I might not be as prepared as I want it to be, as you see with my camera right now.
Don't worry, Shabnam Jan. I can also moderate and then.
Thank you, Mehdi-Jan. I don't know what happened to my camera.
So we
decided.
We have one question in the chat that let me start with
several
that one.
Actually right now.
Several, yeah, there. So Ankush Arora has written, thank you for presentation, Professor Stark. You mentioned earlier in the presentation that scrolls were also part of the lithographic publications or of this milieu, if I heard correctly. Have you come across images of scrolls being depicted in printed images? I'm a PhD student of art history at Yale, researching Lucknow's scrolls and panoramas from the 19th century. Your response would be very helpful.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much for this question. Yes, I have come across depictions of scrolls in these images. They are typically appearing in texts that, refer to scenes from the past. So there are no scrolls, appearing in contemporary compositions. But it is an interesting question also with regard to the fact whether, you know, the text on the scroll is actually legible or whether it is pseudo text or whether the scroll is inscribed at all. But there are images like this, so you should look around a bit more.
Thank you. Next question is from Gindalo Lazaro. Sorry for my pronunciation. Greetings, Professor Stark. Given that Safavid, Afsharid, and Qajar Iran did not really develop a substantial sense of coloniality like that of the late Mughals, I wonder what nuances to the material and intellectual history of the development of Persian lithographic illuminations will be uncovered by engaging in deeper critical, transcultural, decentered, and decolonial analysis.
That's a huge question. Thank you. I did not get the first part of the question. If Mehdi, if you could just repeat it,
yes.
Please.
Given that Safavid, Afsharid, and Qajar Iran did not really develop a substantial sense of coloniality like that of the late Mughals, I wonder what nuances to the material and intellectual history of the development of Persian lithographic illuminations will be uncovered by engaging in deeper critical, transcultural, decentered, and decolonial analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Stark,
So
since the question is a little bit long, you can actually read it in the chat too. The text of it is available in the chat.
Let me just, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one, you know, one part, an obvious answer to this question is, of course, what I've tried to show in the new colonial spaces that come up, like the colonial law court, like colonial figures, and by that I mean largely representatives of the colonial state. Appearing in these images. So, you know, there is a kind of an interesting dynamic of the images between turning to the past, but also addressing the lived experience during colonial times. So that is probably something that you will find more often in an Indian context, of course. How to interpret this is still, at this point, I'm afraid, I don't have a very good sense of what is out there in other languages that I haven't, other language publications that I haven't looked at. So I'm afraid I cannot give a good answer to the question yet. But if we want to you know, compare the Iranian case to the Indian case, what we have to do, it's not enough to look at Persian productions or Urdu or Hindi productions done in India. We also have to look at Marathi, at Gujarati, at Bengali, at other vernacular language illustrated books that might have a very different kind of take on the colonial experience. What I also want to stress is that I think what will come out of this work eventually is also a kind of local difference in illustration, that there are very many different traditions. I've seen a little bit of Banaras, where, you know, most of the images are done in a Hindu context, and the style is very much one that is inspired by folk art, wall paintings, and so on, and is much further removed from some of the images that I have shown you today, where we see, you know, for example, the interference of a modern, international, I would say, cartoon style, as in some of the late 19th century publications. I'm sorry, I've been rambling on a little bit about, you know, trying to answer your question, but it is an important one. But for me, I think it is premature to come up with, you know, with distinctive insights on how the case of Iran and late Mughal India or colonial India differs.
Dr. Ganjavi, may I recommend that you ask people to read their own question rather than
Sure.
you read it?
So if I would ask
you can also raise your hands, everybody, and we can you can unmute yourself and just read it. Just say just read the question.
This is an open public forum, so you don't have to write it and then ask the question.
Yeah, and if Ponit is is here still, it would be great if they would ask their questions themselves.
Yep. Hi, Dr. Stark. I was curious in your initial slides, I believe it was the slide when you're talking about the Gavid Ramayan, I believe. There was also a slide that I noticed that was related to one of the Holy Six scriptures regarding Isai. I was wondering if you could elaborate on your findings regarding like the lithographic intentions of that specific image, or just any other images you found, just because I feel like it's more rare compared to other Islamic or Hindu texts and images.
Yeah. Yeah, so I haven't, thank you for this question. This is another, I haven't really looked at Punjabi and Gurmukhi script publications yet. These are just a couple of images where I wanted to show that scripture is so central. You find images of the Guru Granth on some book covers of the Poti, Janam Sakhi Potis, and you also find a Guru Granth always covered, of course, in cloth, in some of the images appearing in Sikh literature. But it is, I suppose, that there is a much, much richer visual archive out there than I have seen so far. And, once we have explored this archive, I think then comparisons to the frequency and the way that scripture is depicted, as opposed to a Quran, for example, or be the Ramcharitmanas or a Bhagavad Gita, can then be addressed in a more informed way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that would be really cool to study. So
yeah. No, I would love to hear from you if you have come across.
I've been trying. So I'm just finishing up my MLS degree at Western. So I think that would be a interesting avenue to study. We don't have as much archival courses available. So I've been trying to do stuff on my own, but that's very cool. I have some things, but it would be very long to talk about.
Yeah. So I really haven't looked into this archive enough yet, but I suppose if you did, and I don't know, frankly, I don't know where the best collections of Sikh materials are, but it is certainly a worthwhile undertaking to look if there's a different visual idiom, and especially with the depiction of sacred and other texts going on there.
Yeah, thank you. I found a lot of my stuff from Punjab University's archives, as well as the British Museum. They have quite a few works, but it's hard. But thank you.
Yeah, I know that I've been encountering the same problem. I was looking for more images, and they just didn't come up.
Thank you so much. Abul Fazjan, I've noted your hand raised, and we'll come back to you after the questions from the chat. So if I may ask Nasiba to open their mic and ask their questions. It seems so let me read their question. Nasiba has asked, some of your early lithographic images were rendered in line drawing, others in artistic way, showing light and shadows. What is an exact contemporary time span of change according to your study?
there is not one, one point in time where things change. This depends, when I was earlier on mentioning the various regional and local traditions, you find that, in certain classes of books that the aesthetic and the way of drawing, whether it's lines or dots or hatching, continues for a much longer time, whether as opposed to, as for example, some images coming out of a more urban milieu where, where there might be other influences, where people are switching over to the kind of other way of drawing these lithographic images, as we have seen in Shok's, for example, in Shok's images for the Gulistan. So in terms of, of a chronology, I don't think there is a clear answer to that. So people in various places are they are experimenting with various styles of drawing. And we can see that, some of the images become more reduced in a kind of a modern aesthetic, that you have much more empty space. You have, just clear outlines, for example. In other traditions, it is still, the image is still very crowded with lots of hatching, lots of darkened surfaces and so on. So it really depends, this is the kind of work that should be done by an art historian, comparing the images both over time, but also regionally.
I have a suggestion. There is a question by Rebecca Solch that might actually relate to this as well, if we might join them together, which is a question about the relationship between lithographic presses and manuscript making libraries, basically, and their interactions, and whether their practices or their form of archival keeping had any relationship to each other. Have you encountered any documents or any particular writings on maybe transfer of practices or transfer of artists or transfer of ways of doing daily work?
No, I haven't, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I haven't. So what I have encountered is when, when I was in my earlier work, of many calligraphers doing, doing artwork and master calligraphers, then basically for their living, moving over into the sphere of the printing press. But and these master calligraphers are very much hailed as such in the book colophons. So there is a distinct sense of, of keeping up a very high level of presentation of both text and image. But in terms of the techniques, there is just not enough material at my disposal at this point. I suppose there are, manuals like Amanda Lanzillo has recently shown us that, we get some manuals on how to do lithography properly in both Persian and Urdu. But otherwise, I personally haven't come across any discussions by artists that, that would address these questions. Unfortunately not. There must be, I hope that there will be more materials out there to tell this story from the artist's perspective as well, especially those who switched from, other other spaces into the premises of the modern printing press.
I just want to kind of interject with just one example of a material object that might be a bridge between. I have come across it before, but there are quite a few of them at Dr. Tawakoli's own collection. There are sheer transfer papers that traditionally in the European context, there were artist papers. They're saying that the artist used or reclaimed to say that lithography actually bared the hand mark of an artist, because they would paint on it and without any interference between what they painted on it and the stone, they would transfer the markings on a stone and then print a very limited edition, because when the stone is gone, the markings are gone. When the stone is erased, there are no markings. So they're limited edition. Limited edition prints would come out of these transfer papers. Now, the case of India or South Asia is a little bit interestingly different, because these transfer papers correspond to published books, but instead of having no markings, because the markings would then transfer over the stone, we actually have markings still left on them. So you still have the transfer paper with the ink on it intact, and you have the book that corresponds with it that is printed. So we know that they produced this stone with this paper. We know that then they printed a book, but they developed a technology, and I think it's unique, that the ink could sustain more than one transfer. And then was a technique of transferring actually the ink, or playing with the consistency of the ink. Now that actually might produce a bridge, because creating that ink or creating a particular kind of viscosity of the ink or the ink itself and the color is the proprietary knowledge of the Kitabkhane and the library and the manuscript production, who have done this over and over. So there might be a conversation happening between masters of calligraphy and the technicians of Kitabkhane and the author on these. But there has been no manuals that are directly addressing this particular material object. And so far as we know, at least in the past few that we've encountered, there has been not much of a research around it either.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've seen them, if you can comment on them.
Yeah, the problem in the Indian case is very much that we don't have the presses, the printer publishers' archives. So I was, Dr. Tawakoli mentioned that he has these transfer papers from the Naval Kishore Press. And when I was writing my book on the Naval Kishore Press, I was hoping that, you know, this being such a big press, there would be a preserved archive, but it's just not there. So I had to work largely through colonial sources, and another very important source is, of course, what the books tell us themselves in their colophons. And this is, I think this is probably the best way to get into these discussions, to read through, you know, colophons and other paratextual matter, to see whatever is being said about, you know, how calligraphers then, you know, work in this new space, also how artists work in this new space. Unfortunately, artists are not mentioned half as much as master calligraphers. So that's another silence I'm facing right now in this kind of work, looking at visuals.
Thank you. There was one question that I jumped over. Harleen, if you want to unmute, if you're still here. Yes. And you do a question, I'd be thankful.
I just wanted to thank you, Professor Stark, for your expertise and your findings. It was truly insightful. My question sort of aligns with Puneet's on wanting to know more about the Sikh context, but as you indicated, there is a gap in lithography or material research related to Sikhi. So I think at this time I'll refrain from asking questions.
Yeah, well, still, thank you for asking this question. So, you know, this kind of project, which I said at the outset, in the Indian context, not much attention has been given to lithographic illustration yet. There is a lot of interest in lithography as a printing technology. But lithographic illustration has really not been studied across languages and across regions. So it is really, I think, the kind of work that needs a collective of scholars to address it properly. And that means that, you know, somebody who does not read the Gurmukhi script, I'm perhaps not the right person to address the Sikh literature and illustration happening in Sikh lithographed books. But there are other people out there who can do this.
Thank you.
So I think we already
Shiva?
covered. Yes, Shiva and Abulfaz John have raised their hands. Shiva John.
Okay, sorry. Professor Stark, thank you very much. It was very insightful, and I learned a great deal. And I apologize, I can't have my camera on. I have two questions. One is that since your study regarding these illustrated books is more about visuals and what they can tell us, I was wondering if you also consider other visuals in a book, the ones that we know as paratextuality, like font, ink, colors, cover books, the size of the book, and these elements. And my other question is about margin writing. Did you come across books with this marginalia? Because I think that can say something about the reader and the reader interaction with the book.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Of course, there is lots and lots of other, visual elements to be studied. It starts with the elaborately ornamented title pages, where we have different style. So, just different styles for Bombay, different styles for the North. And so we have both calligraphic elements and ornamentation, and both some more pictorial depictions, but also just regular kinds of very well known ornamentation styles. So the title pages are one specific area that deserve more interest in terms of the way that they are very, very carefully made up, and a lot of since the title page is a new thing, so as a marketing tool for lithographic printing in the 19th century, it becomes a very important first look at the book. It's really judging the book by its cover in an artistic aesthetic sense. And then within the books, of course, the way that lithography allows us to be very, very flexible in having marginal texts, and not only one marginal text, we have all these, marginal commentaries, which are usually written at a slant. But you can also do it, you can combine with lithography, you can combine interlinear commentaries with marginal commentaries. I have come in my previous works on lithographed Qurans, I've come across a wonderful edition which combined five different either translations or marginal commentaries on one page. And this is, absolutely beautifully done by using the space and by using the flexibility that lithography allows printers. So a lot going on. Just another thing is just borders. The way that foliage, floral borders are used to make a book more attractive. The way that colophons come in different styles, and the way that we find as still an homage to the manuscript tradition, that we find elaborate headpieces on the opening pages of these lithographed books. So they have the manuscript unvan at the top. I've seen this even in more more humble, more modest publications, but especially in any kind of large scale or religiously oriented book. They very much emulate a manuscript aesthetic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Abulfaz John.
Thank you very much. Actually, my question was answered. So thank you for an excellent talk. Thank you.
Okay, so Leila, you're next.
Thank you so much for your illuminating talk. It was very great. Thank you so much. And I learned a lot, and especially because my first chapter is talking about the history of the lithographs. At one time you mentioned about the imitation of the European style by the lithographers. As we have the same narration in Iran too. For example, the state printing house also produced lithograph translation from European language with images. And one example that I can say is the painting by Abu Turab Ghaffari depicting a translated book about the English woman in India. So my question is that by the production of European images created in Iran and India, where the production of lithographic images was more limited, when the lithographer or artists were trying to imitate the same European image. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's great to know about the parallels in the in the Iranian case here. So the kind of modern aesthetic that you are referring to is largely found in periodical publications. We do find it in books a little bit, but the periodical publications are another space which deserve our attentions because they were really going with the times, and there's much more change. They're less conservative than book illustration, I would say. So that is the space to look for. But I don't think that I did not get the part of about the limitations in your questions.
If they did have a limitation in terms of the image drawing, because they're imitating this European style, and the style was a bit different from what they actually wanted to print, like on the stone. So as I was looking at the paintings, I realized that the line were more coarse and not as soft as the European style, and flowing as European style. But did you realize that differences when you studies those European style imitations?
Yeah. So again, it depends very much on the first of all, on the actual equipment of the printing press. We have to remember that, many of these printing presses are very small businesses in India. So they are not necessarily, they don't necessarily have the latest equipment. And also the artists, the illustrators, the calligraphers are not necessarily very well trained. Some of them would have little training or no training in this European style, new European style of painting, and would just dabble in it. So there's two things coming together here, and again, there is no archive for that. There is the skills, the technical skills of the person, of the illustrator, but there's also the equipment of the printing press as such.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's we don't know whether to what extent, especially the many small scale printers were able to keep up with the latest technological developments in lithography.
Thank you.
So thank you. The questions are from the chat are already asked. There are several participants have shared how thankful they are for all the insights that you brought and all your findings. One, I need to acknowledge Dr. Roxana Zemhari, whose work you also mentioned on Mir-Djalali Khoi's master illustrator, has also shared her thanking for your insightful presentation. Professor Tawakkoli, the floor is yours.
Professor Stark, thank you for your impressive presentation, and we look forward to having you in Toronto in person and sharing with you some of the transfer papers, some of these author agreements and the disputes that were part of it when you come to Toronto. Again, thank you for your fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would love to come to Toronto, not only to see these, these documents, but also to see them. Thank you very much. And thank you for your patience. And you've been a wonderful audience.
Thank you. Thank you also to all of our colleagues who attended this session. We wish you a wonderful day.
Thanks very much to all of you.
Thank you.